everyone, and welcome to Four Lads Had a Dream podcast. My name is Stevie Clifford. I am your host today. For a different kind of podcast, we're joined by two members of the Rangers Fan Advisory Board, Mr. Stuart Langan and Mr. Fahd Barry. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Stuart, if you just want to kick us off and give us a wee bit of introduction into yourself and the Fan Advisory Board, and then Fahd will get you in to speak as well, mate.
Yeah, brilliant, Stevie, and good afternoon. Thanks for having us on, first of all. It's great to be part of it, and we see this as part of the journey of sort of like getting the profile out there of what the Fan Advisory Board is all about. I don't think we need to go into the credentials of MD on the Fan Advisory Board, along with Faddy and five of the rest of the team, and I'm sure we can come on to who they are. We were appointed onto the inaugural Fan Advisory Board in November of last year after a kind of selection process that was run, and happy to go into some of the detail of that as well, because I think it might be important in terms of some of the impartiality and so on around that process. So I'm a season ticket holder at the club, sit in the Sandy Jardine rear, and I've sat there since the seats were a different colour, which gives you a bit of an idea. So that's me, Stevie.
What about you, Faddy? Obviously, thanks for joining us on the podcast, but can you just give us a wee intro into yourself? And obviously, I'm not asking for credentials, buddy. You don't need to prove why you're here. Of course, that's not the aim of this, but just a wee introduction to people watching.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Stevie. A pleasure to be on. My name's Fahd Barry. I am 34 years old, father of three, live in the south side of Glasgow. Grew up a stone's throw away from Ibrox through my whole life, lived in Pollokshields, Dumbreck, and then recently moved out into the East Renfrewshire area and became a stereotypical Southsider. So in terms of my day job, I am a director at Deloitte. I focus on mergers and acquisitions. And in terms of my everything else, it takes up all my time these days. Outside of that busy life, it's the Fan Advisory Board. I've been a Rangers fan since birth, following in the footsteps of my dad, my uncle. Been going to games since I was a little boy, home and away. A season ticket holder. I go with my younger sister and my eldest son. So you'll see us sitting in the club deck. Very, very happy to talk to anyone who's a Rangers fan. Very, very happy to open up about my experiences of following the club, and look forward to chatting a bit about what the Fan Advisory Board is in this little segment.
Yeah, absolutely, gentlemen. So the reason why we're here is just to explain a wee bit about the Fan Advisory Board and just to tackle some of the thoughts and narrative that are already around it. So what we're going to do is just go into basically straight away, Stuart, and we'll just ask you about the basic aims of the Fan Advisory Board and what the thought process is behind it.
Yeah, it's a pretty fundamental question. I mean, Fan Advisory Board, the concept of it is new to Rangers, but it's not a new thing across clubs elsewhere in the UK and indeed across Europe. And, as part of the process of setting it up, when the club were looking at it, they engaged Ashley Brown from the Football Supporters Association in England, to make sure we were getting kind of best practice. But fundamentally, what we are there to do is a little bit of what it says on the tin is to give advice to the board, the executive board of the club, from a fan perspective. There's nothing really off limits in terms of what that includes. And I'll maybe come on to a little change that's happened in the last couple of months or so. But whether that be on, the club's direction, its plans, stadium issues, maybe a bit of a topic of the day. Our job is there to put that fan perspective into the conversation. And the Fan Advisory Board gives a kind of structured approach to that. I think the other thing is that to make sure that we get as broad a view of the fans central in every discussion or decision that the club are making. Now, that's a massive aspiration. I get that. But it gives a kind of vehicle for the club to engage in fan sentiment on a whole range of issues, but also gives us the opportunity to proactively go at the club on, big issues, small issues, whatever they might be. Faddy, would you add anything to that, mate?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's exactly what the purpose of the board is. It's to support, guide, have a voice for the fans, but at the same time, more importantly, it's an independent view for the board to just kind of throw ideas off let us know about things that are coming down the pipeline, and then kind of taking that into consideration alongside everything else that the board has to take into consideration when they come to making a decision. I think that's quite an important nuance to just state at the outset. We feed into the process, but the board and the club, they make the decisions. They are the ones that's their day job, that they're paid to make those decisions. And so they are the ones that kind of will take the accountability and responsibility for the decisions that they make. But we will obviously feed into the process, and we're more than happy to be supportive throughout that. But also, as we'll no doubt discuss throughout this section, we'll be that challenge and we'll be that independent voice in the room.
That's what I was about to ask, and that kind of takes us nicely actually to the next thing. You would have seen the reaction already online. X is a place, formerly Twitter, that is very vocal. I've had it. As soon as you put your head above the parapet and the Rangers support, you're there to be got at, I suppose. We're all aware of that. The accusation is already, and I've been there and had this, that we're too close to the board, and that you are, for want of a better expression, puppets for the board. A simple statement the other day about saying, you welcome more kind of dialogue from the board reacted from the fans on X. Personally, I didn't see there was much wrong with it. I'm maybe looking at it from your point of view because I've been on the end of that as well. How do you ensure that this narrative doesn't go forward, that this is what the fan advisory board are there just to back up the boardroom and not be the voice of the fans and just be another kind of vessel for the board to pacify or whatever? So
I think on that one, I think it's important just to go back over what Stuart mentioned just a couple of minutes ago around, let's take it right back to the start. The purpose behind the fan advisory board being created and how it was created, the recruitment process for it. So when Rangers announced that they wanted to undertake this as part of their fan engagement strategy, they brought in kind of independent individuals who are experienced in fan advisory boards. So Ashley Brown, who Stuart mentioned, he is a coordinator within the Football Supporters Association. So someone who has been around the fan engagement and strategy scene amongst football clubs for a long, long time. And he helped select the people that were to be involved on the board alongside John Gilligan, who is clearly a former board member, but no longer involved at the club in a decision-making capacity. And then Greg Marshall coordinated it. So Greg was probably the only one from the club, effectively, who had a role, but he didn't really have a sort of role in the decision. He was more there just to coordinate logistics, make sure that the interviews stayed on track, etc., and people were given a kind of fair crack at the whip, so that there's just consistency throughout. So 7 of us were chosen. All 7 of us come from very different backgrounds. So there are obviously some similarities in terms of business credentials that a lot of people on the fan advisory board have, but everyone comes from a different demographic of the support. Me personally, I come from a demographic that does not typically support Rangers in this city, let's be honest. A lot of the people from my community will support the other side of the city, and there are reasons for that, which we don't need to get into in this call, but it's the same for everyone that was selected on the board. None of us really had any sort of prior engagements with the Rangers board or Rangers Football Club. We'll have come across them. I came across a couple of the PLC board members in my day job, but not to any extent where there was any sort of personal relationship. And I know a couple of my colleagues on the FAB who have been involved in the Union Bears and some of the supporters buses. They will have had interactions with the Rangers board, but not to the point where there was a formal personal relationship. So we've all come into this as outsiders. And I think that's quite an important distinction to make from the outset. The second part is our role. What do we exist for? Now, the first thing that we did was we selected Stuart as our chair and we selected Matt Boyd as our vice chair. And Matt Boyd is we were quite deliberate, and we wanted these 2 guys to be the sort of leaders of our little group. And at the same time, we set out what was our strategy going to be. What did we want to get from our time on the FAB to make it as productive as possible? And we did all of that by ourselves. We didn't do that by speaking to the board, by speaking to the club about what the priorities were for the club. we spoke initially about what are our priorities, what are our motivations for joining the FAB, and therefore what do we want to get out of the 2 or 3 years that we're going to be on this panel of individuals. Subsequently to that, we then interacted with the club, then interacted with the board, understood the agenda of the club right now. What are the key items that are impacting the club, from player strategy to recruitment to tickets and MyJers and that sort. And we then look to kind of mesh it together to understand, okay, this is what our strategy is going to be over the next couple of years and how we are going to support the club. The conversation is very much driven by us. It's not driven by what the club want us to be. And ultimately, some of that might come out in the minutes. Some of it might not, because you don't necessarily get all of the context when you're just reading text on a page. And I saw some of the criticism that was leveled our way from speaking about WWE, which we'll park to the side, but it was an important conversation around club merchandise and counterfeiting our kind of trademarks and IP, which led into that, which sometimes people don't really kind of see it all the way through when it's just in text form. To people criticizing us for not being direct or challenging enough, when again the tone doesn't necessarily come out in the minutes, but I think from the outset of the last minutes you can see I personally spoke up and spoke up about, you know, the club needing to take more accountability for things that have happened on the park, for things that have happened off the park, and wanting to see a bit more of that taking responsibility as we move forward. So I think we are being quite direct, but in a constructive way, and that's really, really important. And I've been speaking a while. Maybe let Stuart kind of chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, Stevie, you know, just to build on everything that Fahdy said, which obviously I agree with, but I think, you know, to the heart of your question, how do we stop this becoming a narrative that we're board plants and shills and blazer chasers? We've all heard the phraseology, right? You know, first of all, you know better than anybody, if you put your head above the parapet, you're going to expect that, and that's okay, right? And it's understandable. But for me, there's a couple of things. Transparency is the most, you know, the most important thing. You know, I think we need to, over time, you know, give the support, the confidence that we will be transparent. There will be things that we'll engage with the club on that we won't get our way on. I think this is important that we tell everybody that. And that's fine. That's a, you know, a product of a healthy relationship. We need to give fans the full picture, but most importantly, we've got to be accessible, right? You know, whether that's through our presence online, whether that's through meeting fans. You know, we met Stevie at the fan engagement forum. You know, we'll build that process, you know, and profile. I think fundamentally, though, anybody who knows us will know that what you don't have is 7 patsies on this board. You know, I don't think any of us would want to be part of something that was that box ticking exercise. And that for me is the right way to do it. You know, we'll give constructive challenge. We'll be direct when we need to be. And you know, hopefully through the two-way engagement we get with as much of the fan body as we can, that we'll be representing the views of as many Rangers fans and cohorts of Rangers fans as we can.
Yeah, knowing Matt Boyd, I don't think Matt would be part of something that was, you know, preempted, so to speak. So yeah, I've stood beside.
And the same goes for you know.
Absolutely. What the point was that I'm not knowing all of the group, but knowing Matt's not going to get involved in something like that. And I've known you for a while, Stuart, and I don't think that's the case either. But what I would ask is, and it kind of merges into what you're discussing, boys, but it's an important question and one that the fans would probably want answered, is that how can we ensure and how can you ensure that you hold the board to account for kind of crucial fan matters? And are you able and would you be willing to kind of stand up at points where they're maybe not going to agree with you?
100%, and that was actually I remember going right, something that Fahdy touched on, going right back to the process for getting involved in this. I was very clear. I remember having the conversation with John Gilligan that it only works if we're prepared to stand up to the board. You know, and as Fad says, you know, the first half of our last meeting with the club was a very uncomfortable conversation for everybody in that room, because it was, you know, going very directly to what the sentiment was of the fans. So unequivocally, we will not, and we've also had engagement with the club over the last 2 or 3 weeks on the issue of the stadium. And again, these are direct conversations, these are direct communications that, I don't think leave anybody in any doubt that, the fan advisory board will be there to put, the strong voice. Yes, it's constructive because ultimately what we want to do is help the club get a successful team on the park with, 50,000 passionate fans around the stadium. But, I'm in absolutely no doubt that me and the other 6 guys involved in this will, absolutely, face into the difficult issues. And we can maybe talk about some of the most pressing issues as we go on in this conversation as well.
Fahd, just on that, mate, would you have anything kind of to add on being able to, I suppose being able to be right in the mix when it really counts, because the fans maybe don't have that voice, and I know they've looked to us in the past at fan media, but would you just kind of back up what Stuart said about being prepared to, no matter how difficult it is, be able to stand up and have your say in those matters?
Absolutely. Similar to Stuart, when I interviewed for their position, much of the interview centered around what I perceived to be as mistakes that the previous board had made, and open conversations around how I wasn't happy over things like the Sydney debacle, the issues with Castori and our kits getting released early, and all sorts of issues that were very publicly discussed. I openly spoke in that meeting about how my motivation for joining the FAB was partly driven by a desire to stop incidents like that happening again. The Sydney friendly, in my book, it should never have happened. I strongly believe if a FAB was in place prior to that decision being made, it wouldn't have happened. And so keen to ensure that the board is held to account to make sure that things like that don't happen again. And from the conversations that we've had with the board, to be completely honest with you, Stevie, they want that challenge. They do want us to come to those meetings and challenge them. James, I know he's obviously left now, but James Bisgrove was very open to being challenged, very open to a direct conversation. The meeting that we just had in June, like Stuart's, I mean, the first 30 minutes were very direct. It was very direct. It was everyone in the fan advisory board getting a moment to effectively have a little bit of a moan and be direct and say, there's a lot that's going wrong with the club right now, a lot off the park. Our transfers are not where it needs to be. The season didn't go the way it should have gone. And we wanted answers. We wanted to know what's being done. How will we correct it? We want people to take responsibility for what's happened, not just let it kind of get swept under the carpet. We move into the next season. That's quite important to me, that accountability, that transparency. My day job is holding people to account. It's asking those questions through diligence, difficult questions of management teams in high intensity environments. I fully intend, and I have done in the time that I've been on the board, and fully intend in the remainder of the time that I'll be on the board to hold the board to account. There's nothing personal in it for me. There's no issues. I just want the best for Rangers Football Club, and I think the best way we can get the best for Rangers Football Club is to make sure that our board are performing to a high level. And in order to do that, they need us to hold them to account and challenge them.
Nicely on to, I suppose, our next question. And I appreciate, I don't really want to know what you have discussed with the board. That's not why we're here. But more to say that, what do you think the current most pressing issues that affect the support? And you've talked about accountability and maybe that kind of side of it, Faddy. What would you say, and sure, I'll come to you in a wee second as well, what would you say the current pressing issues that the fans feel that they have that the board maybe don't recognise?
I think if we're gonna ignore the elephant in the room, which is the Copeland Road stand and everything that's on around that, I think the one thing that we've spoken about as a group that we feel, and from people that we've spoken to are also Rangers fans feel, is the communication from the board. And I think there's a sentiment that the fan base needs to be treated like adults. Communications don't always have to be carefully manicured with a dozen different outcomes of what might be after the case. Fans are the lifeblood of Rangers Football Club. We deserve to be treated with respect, not contempt. And I think direct communication with us is super important. And I think that the club are aware of that. And I think that they need, that's something that definitely has to be improved.
Yeah, I think just building on that, I think for me, Stevie, there's a couple of things that most definitely you need to take the fans on the journey with you, you know, and maybe move away from, you know, more almost like set piece communications and more of a routine, regular dialogue with fans, right? But without, and I'm no comms expert, but I think also on top of that, the direction of the club. You know, I think if the fan base want to know anything, yes, there's things that underpin that, like where are we financially and so on, but what is the direction of the club? Where are we going? And actually, in one of our earlier meetings, James took us through what we're basically calling the 2030 strategy. And the first thing we said is, guys, fans need to know what this is, you know? So I think there's actually a lot of good stuff going on in the club, but it's too opaque to the fan base at the moment. So I think we need to get much better and much more on the front foot in terms of bring the fan base with you. You know, I think I just touched on finances for a second. You know, obviously really pertinent at this time of year, given its transfer window. Now, of course, I don't expect the club, for example, to come out and say, here's how much money Phil Clement's got in his transfer kitty, right? You don't. That's not a sensible thing to do, right? But overarching that, I think the fans have got a very legitimate question, and obviously it gets touched on at AGMs and so on, but AGMs are a slightly different purpose. You know, they're for shareholders, and you know, yes, most fans are most shareholders are fans, I should say, but I think there's a bit in the middle that really needs bridged.
It's funny you should say that because I've had similar conversations with people at the club with regards to communication and things like that. And I think the more you take the fans with you, I think the more accepting and galvanising they'll be. The whole, to put it in a football context, we all went with Steven Gerrard because we could see where it was going and he outlined his vision, and we knew that it might take a while, but we all stuck with it because we knew, I think, if the club were a wee bit more open on certain things. And I'm not saying that they have to tell you the nitty gritty like you just discussed. We don't need to know that Philip Clement has X, Y, and Z. But if we were involved in the process a bit more and where it was taking us, I definitely agree.
What happens on that, Stevie? Just to come in on that, what happens if they don't do that is the void gets filled with narratives set by Celtic fans, Aberdeen fans, Dundee United fans, everybody in the media who clearly, have had issues in the past with Rangers Football Club, and those narratives become the dominant narratives. Now, last year, the chairman indicated that there was a black hole in Rangers finances. So just touch on the point that Stuart's mentioned, this £10 million operating loss that he was going to close the gap and he was going to do stuff to correct that. There hasn't been any conversation on that publicly to the fan base. So that's filled. What happens is other people for their own nefarious reasons, therefore then spread the narrative that Rangers have no money, administration 2 is on its way, Rangers are struggling, they've got this massive black hole in their budget. How are they going to do that? Their wage bill's the highest it's ever been, etc., etc., etc. And you just allow other narratives to take the lead. And I think that if we do take a more transparent approach with more regular communications, more regular updates to the fans, then it allows the club to take the lead on what it wants its fans to see and hear, which I think is very important.
I think touching on something else Stuart said, which is quite interesting, and not to try and defend everybody, but there are some good things happening at the club that people don't know about. And my situation is, and the thing that I've said with regards to the communication is, the fans maybe only see what's right in front of us, and what we see right in front of us is not as many transfers as we want, the stadium situation, etc., etc. So, Stuart, on that point, I definitely think that's something that would be more welcome.
Yeah, definitely, Stevie. And actually, I touched on right at the start one subtle change that's happened in the lifetime of the Fan Advisory Board. When it was initially set up, it was essentially James Bisgrove and all of the what you might call non-footballing directors. Karim, James Taylor, Craig Robertson, etc. But from our last meeting, Niels Coppin's coming along to the meetings as well. Now, I think there's maybe if somebody wants us to ask about why the staff take all our free kicks, I don't think that's going to be on the agenda. But
I've tried that, to be fair.
But you'll have seen in the minutes that Niels gave us a bit of an introduction into the footballing philosophy in terms of what kind of players we target and all that kind of stuff. There's great stuff to come out, and actually some of that got a pretty positive reaction from the minutes. But just getting a little bit deeper into some of the thinking that's going on behind the scenes in the club, if that's the one thing that we can do, and then be really transparent with the fan base. Yes, the minutes go out, but as Fahd touched on, sometimes it needs a little bit more colour, and hopefully through conversations with yourself, through our Twitter account, and anybody else who wants to talk to us, and we'll create a visible profile for ourselves at fan engagement meetings and so on. I think over time, hopefully, we'll see the benefits of that.
Finally, before we kind of come to a conclusion on that, what would be the Fan Advisory Board's stance on the current kind of running of key issues and things like that? Because obviously there's a lot of unrest, and I don't expect anybody to sit here and slate anything that's went on. That's not what we're trying to do. But would you be in a position to advise and feedback to the board and maybe go along and say, we done this, but we should maybe have done this in a better way? And is that your kind of role? And would you be feeding them back? And we're talking obviously about stadium stuff and things that's happened. That's the obvious one. So
exactly, Stevie, right? And I'll maybe start if that's okay, and Fahd, I'm sure will jump in. But in terms of the whole Copeland issue, right? Many of us have been involved in projects and so on, our day job. Many of the Rangers fans have been involved in construction projects. Projects can go wrong, right? And then back to this thing about we're all adults. We can get our heads around that, right? But what I struggled with, and I know the rest of the Fan Advisory Board members struggled with, and we've alluded to it, is the vacuum that was allowed to happen, right? And I think what that did was just allow that void to get filled, as Fahd said, but it then just created a wave of negativity. So we have fed that back to the club directly. I've had a couple of conversations with the club about it. We've emailed them, almost like begging them at that point, say, could you please just say something to the fans? We can get our heads around it. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and one thing I can absolutely guarantee, Stevie, is that the very first item on the agenda for our next meeting with the club, which I think is due to be early August. We don't have a date for it yet, but we're committed to early August, will be State of the Nation and what lessons can we learn from what's going on.
Fahd, I'd probably ask if you've got anything to add on that, mate.
I think that Stuart's hit the nail on the head with regards to the Copeland Road issue. There are other topics and other issues that we do sort of almost, I want to say, informally advise on. So things like we feedback on, things like the MyJer situation or point situations for certain games. So clearly we've got people in on the Fab like Craig, who's a really good guy, and he's home and away, travels everywhere. He's the man for tickets, and I think the SLO will quite often.
That Craig's going to get 1,000 emails every now and then. You're the man for tickets. Fahd said that. We don't get tickets on the Fab.
Yeah, no, not yet. No, nothing to do with the Fab. No, nothing to do with the Fab on his in individual capacity. But it's more around kind of feedback around what the fan sentiment around Celtic being gold only, etc. So we are feeding back in real time fan sentiment on some of those other topics that are going on around the club. that aren't getting much airtime right now. I mean, one of the things that I am speaking to the SLO around is it's a topic close to me. It's not going to be a topic close to many others, but it's around unsponsored jerseys and about making the club, a bit more inclusive to other communities around the city. And that's something that we will continue to have dialogue on in the background, but it's not. We're not going to shout from it, and everyone knows that this is going on necessarily. But we are pushing the fan sentiment, fan voice in the background on various things with the club, and we'll continue to do that. The more that fans feed into us, the better it is for us. The better understanding we have of how fans feel about certain things, and we can then take that back to the club with a broad view in a constructive way, which is really important.
Excellent, guys. Listen, we could talk all day, I think, about Rangers, all of us, and we've not even touched transfers or what's going on in the park, which I'm sure we'd all rather. Listen, all joking aside, I think we'd all rather be here talking about who we're going to be signing and things like that. But obviously, Rangers at the moment, there's so much going on. How can we contact you? How can we contact the Fan Advisory Board? And what would you say to people that are watching this about getting in contact and share your socials with us and things so that we'll put the socials obviously in the links as well, guys, just so that you can go and speak to the boys and find out a little bit more about the Fan Advisory Board, Stuart. But where can we find you and how do we contact you?
Yeah, and first things first to you, thanks for that. Please contact us. That's why we've got, we're creating a public profile. So on X or Twitter, as it used to be, @Rangers_Fab is our Twitter handle. But email contact@rangersfab.co.uk. Please do email us. We will get back to us. There's the 7 of us. There's myself, Fahd, Matt, Craig, Kelly, Jamie. We'll all get back to everybody, and of course Gary, who's in New York at the moment. But contact@rangersfab.co.uk. We might not be able to answer directly every single thing we get, but one thing I'll guarantee is that picture of fan sentiment, we will absolutely take it and use it in our conversations with the club.
Excellent. Listen, thank you both for joining us. Faddy, thanks for joining us, mate.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stevie. Anytime.
Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate that, mate. And thanks everybody for watching. You can contact us, obviously, for Lads of the Dream, but get on to the Fan Advisory Board, speak to the boys and girls and give them their feedback, because that's the only way that we can improve, by doing this kind of thing. So please get in contact with them, and it only improves. And hopefully today has helped create a better understanding of why the Fan Advisory Board is there and who to speak to and how we can challenge and make sure that we're being as productive as we can as a Fan Advisory Board and as supporters as well. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks again, Stuart and Faddy, and we'll see you soon on For Lads of the Dream. Thank you.
For Lads podcast is sponsored by Rhino Express, Clydeview Joinery, Athol Industrial Solutions Limited and CSD Air Conditioning, along with Art of Gold. Thank you for listening or watching the podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show.